The ballroom smelled like money and bad decisions. Nora Callahan noticed that first, the specific combination of expensive cologne, open bar, and central heating cranked too high for November in Manhattan. The Archer Hotel's rooftop ballroom on West 45th Street was performing elegance. Edison lights strung between exposed beams, white linen on every table, a projection screen cycling through photographs of people who had been 17 years old together and were now proving the decade that followed. 43 people, 10 years, one room full of carefully managed impressions. Nora stood near the east wall in her black Banana Republic dress, ironed twice, still slightly creased, holding a glass of Cabernet she had not touched. She had rehearsed this. One nod to Griffin if they crossed paths. 3 words maximum. Then she was in a car back to Queens before 10. The plan had been airtight in her apartment in Woodside while Priya Okafor sat on her bed, watching her apply mascara, and said, with the specific honesty earned through 11 years of friendship, "Nora, you don't need to prove anything to a man who made you feel small in a Cheesecake Factory parking lot." Nora had come anyway, because letting Griffin Shaw decide which rooms she entered felt worse than anything he could possibly say. That math had made sense in Queens. It was failing spectacularly now. Griffin was across the room, charcoal suit, shorter hair, the easy posture of someone who had recently started making real money. The woman beside him wore sapphire silk and a Cartier bracelet that caught the Edison lights every time she moved. When Griffin saw Nora, he crossed the room the way a man crosses a room when he believes he has nothing to apologize for. Then Kevin Park, 3 drinks deep and deeply unhelpful, said too loudly, "Are you two back together? I always said you were the real deal." Griffin smiled. He tilted his head, the pause Nora had once mistaken for thoughtfulness. Then he said it, conversational, almost kind. "Back together?" He looked at Nora the way you look at a math problem that doesn't resolve cleanly. "Come on. Who would even marry you at this point? You're 32. You design pet food packaging. You've been renting the same apartment for 6 years." He was not shouting. He was not performing. He stated it as fact, among other facts, in a room where 8 people heard every word. Nora felt the wine glass in her hand. She felt the heat of the room on her bare shoulders. She did not cry. She did not pour the Cabernet on his charcoal suit, though the thought arrived with alarming clarity. She stood completely still, and in the far corner of the room, near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking West 45th Street, a man she had never seen before had gone very still. Tall, dark suit, no tie, one button open, holding whiskey he was not drinking, looking at her with an expression she could not read from across the room. Not pity, not amusement. Something quieter and more dangerous than either. He was not supposed to be at a 10-year reunion. He did not belong in this room. And he had not looked away from Griffin Shaw since the moment Griffin opened his mouth. Nora did not remember the exact moment she had started making herself smaller around Griffin Shaw. That was the thing about that kind of damage. It didn't arrive as a single event you could point to. It arrived as accumulation, the way water damages a foundation. Not flood, but slow seeping year after year until one morning the walls are soft and you can't remember when they were solid. She had met Griffin at a gallery opening in Williamsburg, the fall she was 28. He was tall, funny, from the kind of family that had a house in Connecticut and opinions about wine, and he had looked at her across the room with the particular attention that makes a woman feel like she is the only interesting thing in a crowded space. He asked her what she did. She said she was a graphic designer. His face had done something, not quite disappointment, not quite revision, something in between. And then he had smiled and said, "Creative type." I respect that. The first sign she had not read correctly. Over 3 years, Griffin did not yell. He did not break things. He did not do any of the things that would have made it simple to name what was happening and walk out. Instead, he refined her, quietly and without malice. He suggested she dress differently for dinners with his colleagues. He explained, more than once, that her apartment in Queens was a liability for someone who wanted to be taken seriously. He used phrases like "your potential" and "someday when you're more established," as though she were a project at an early stage of development rather than a fully formed person. He told his friends she was a designer the way you tell someone your car is old, but runs fine. When she got her first major client, a regional food brand that paid $12,000 for a complete visual identity, Griffin had congratulated her with the enthusiasm of someone who has been told a child has won a participation ribbon. "Lovely," he said. "That's really lovely." His mother, Elaine Shaw, who had the kind of social access that came from 6 decades of strategic friendship, had once said at a dinner in Greenwich, "Griffin, she's charming? Is she the one?" And Griffin had said, "She's very talented, Mom," with a pause before very that lasted approximately 1 second too long. Nora had excused herself to the bathroom and spent 4 minutes gripping the edge of a marble sink. She had stayed 2 more years after that dinner, because she had believed, with the stubborn faith of someone who is both intelligent and temporarily unable to apply that intelligence to themselves, that she was the problem. That if she grew her client list, if she moved to a better neighborhood, if she became the version of herself Griffin seemed to be waiting for, the pause before very would close. It never closed. When Griffin ended it, gently, over dinner, with the phrase, "I just don't think we're building toward the same future," Nora had driven home alone on the BQE and understood, with devastating clarity, that she had spent 3 years auditing herself for a man who had already made his decision. What she did not yet understand was how much of herself she had handed over, and how long it was going to take to get it back. The morning after the reunion, Nora's MacBook Air showed 47 unopened emails. 31 were newsletters she had never unsubscribed from. 9 were invoices already past their follow-up window. 5 were from a client named Pagecraft Design Agency, and when she opened the first one at 7:42 in the morning, standing in her kitchen in Queens with coffee going cold on the counter, the words took a moment to arrange themselves into meaning. "After careful review of our current creative partnerships, we have decided to consolidate our vendor relationships. Your contract will not be renewed at the end of this quarter." Pagecraft represented 60% of Nora's monthly income. She had held that contract for 2 years. She read the email 4 times, then set her phone face down on the counter and stood very still, which was apparently what she did now when something structural gave way beneath her. By 9, she had called her bank, confirmed the numbers she already knew were not good, and added up 3 months of rent against her remaining savings in a mental calculation that produced a number she then immediately refused to look at directly. By 10, she was in Midtown, because she had a meeting with a potential new client, a cosmetics startup on the 44th floor of a building on Park Avenue, and she had the specific discipline of someone who has been freelancing long enough to know that you show up even when everything is falling. The building was 49 floors of dark glass and corporate authority. She cleared security, got into the elevator, pressed 44. The doors were closing when a hand came through, and they reopened. The man who stepped in was tall. Dark suit, no tie. She recognized him immediately, with a lurch in her chest, as the man from the corner of the reunion ballroom last night. He pressed the button for 49 without looking at the panel, which told Nora he did not need to look. He stood at the other end of the elevator and looked straight ahead, and the silence lasted exactly 3 floors before he said, without turning, "They'll tell you the creative direction has shifted." When she looked at him, he met her eyes for the first time at close range, and they were gray, not blue, the kind of gray that does not offer warmth as a default. He continued, "The cosmetics company on 44. They closed the vendor search yesterday afternoon. Save yourself 40 minutes. Nora stared at him. "You know my meeting?" He looked back at the doors. "I own the building." The elevator reached 44. The doors opened. Nora did not move. "Who are you?" she asked. He said, "The man who watched your ex-boyfriend publicly humiliate you last night and took his photograph." She felt cold. Then he said, calm and even, "I have a proposition that may be of mutual benefit." The doors started to close. He put one hand out and held them open, and he looked at her with the patience of someone who already knows the answer and is waiting for the question to catch up. The 49th floor did not look like an office. It looked like a decision had been made long ago, that anyone who needed to be impressed by furniture should not be in this room. The desk was dark walnut, clean. 2 chairs, a wall of windows facing Park Avenue, and beyond it the gray geometry of Manhattan in November. A woman in a black blazer brought coffee without being asked and left without making sound. Nora sat down because standing felt like performing a confidence she did not currently possess, and she had always been honest with herself about the gap between feeling and presentation. The man sat across from her. "Roman Vale," he said, and placed a business card on the desk between them. "CEO, Vale Industries." She picked up the card. Thick stock, black ink, no logo. The address was this building. She set it down. "You own this building," she said. "Among others," he said. He opened a folder that was already on the desk, and she realized with a crawling sensation that the folder contained information about her. Pagecraft contract terms, her current client list, her lease in Queens, a figure that was approximately her bank balance as of this morning. She felt her jaw tighten. "You ran a background check on me." He looked at her without apology. "I run background checks on everyone I consider working with." She said, "I haven't agreed to work with you." He said, "Not yet." He leaned back, and the morning light from the Park Avenue windows was behind him, which meant she was reading his face against brightness, which she suspected was not accidental. "Here is what I need," he said. His voice was level and unhurried, the voice of someone who has spent decades saying things once. "There is an expansion deal I am finalizing in London. Several European partners require due diligence on personal stability and long-term planning before they commit. The simplest signal is a spouse. I need a wife on paper for 6 months, beginning December 1st. Nora let the sentence settle. "On paper," she said. "Legally married, publicly visible at specific functions, no other requirements beyond that. After 6 months, quiet dissolution." She counted 4 seconds of silence. In return, he continued, and he turned the folder around so she could read the number at the bottom of the last page. Nora had learned, through freelancing, how to receive financial information without changing her face. She was grateful for that training now. The number was enough to retire her Queens apartment debt, fund 6 months of creative independence, and begin the business she had been planning on a Google Doc she opened every few months and then quietly closed. "Why me?" she said. He said, "Because I was in that room last night." because you stood still when most people would have either collapsed or made a scene. Because the man who humiliated you is connected to a city councilman I need to understand better. And your history with him gives me access to that story. And because, he said, and here he paused in a way that was not Griffin's calculated pause, but something different, something that felt like precision rather than theater. You looked like someone who has been waiting for the correct door to open. Nora looked at him across the walnut desk with the Park Avenue light at his back, and she thought, this man is dangerous. She also thought, so is doing nothing. She said, I'll need the terms in writing by Thursday. Nora signed the contract on a Thursday in the office of Wade Lennox on the 41st floor of a building in Midtown that felt like the inside of a watch. Precise, cold, expensive. She used a pen that was sitting on the desk, which she later realized was a Mont Blanc, and she did not make a comment about it because she was doing the thing she always did in rooms where she felt like the least powerful person. She made herself very focused and very calm, and she read every word. Wade Lennox was 50 years old and had the specific energy of someone who has resolved so many other people's complications that he found nothing surprising anymore. He explained the terms in a voice like a document being read aloud. Public appearances at 4 functions, minimum. Residence in the Vale apartment on the Upper East Side for the duration. A joint filing with the city clerk, which would be reversed at the 6-month mark via standard dissolution proceedings. Nora asked 3 questions, and he answered all 3 without hesitation, which told her the answers had been prepared. What she did not tell Roman Vale when she signed the contract, what she did not tell Wade Lennox or Priya or anyone, was that she was carrying a specific and quietly devastating piece of information she had received 6 days before the reunion. Her landlord had not simply raised her rent, as he did every year. He had sold the building. The new owner, a development company Nora had not yet traced, had issued 30-day notices to all month-to-month tenants. Nora's lease expired December 15th. She had 17 days past signing this contract to find a new apartment in a city where her income had just lost 60% of its floor. She had not told Roman Vale because she had not wanted to seem desperate, and she had not wanted to seem desperate because she was, in fact, desperate, and she had learned, over 32 years, that desperation handed to other people becomes leverage. She moved into the Upper East Side apartment on a Saturday. Theo Bass, large, quiet, with the posture of someone who has stopped rooms simply by entering them, carried the 4 boxes she had brought from Queens in 2 trips and did not comment on the fact that 4 boxes represented the totality of what she was bringing into a 10-room apartment, worth more than her annual income multiplied by 8. The apartment was on the 23rd floor of a building on East 72nd Street. The living room had a view of Central Park that Nora stood in front of for approximately 90 seconds before she made herself stop and unpack her MacBook. She had a client pitch to finish by Monday. One of her 2 remaining clients, a Brooklyn bakery that paid her $1,100 a month and deserved her full attention. She sat at the kitchen table, which was marble and very cold, and opened her laptop and did the work. That night, Roman Vale came home at 10:47. He said, "The kitchen is fully stocked." She said, "I noticed." He said, "You worked all day." It was not a question. She said, "I have clients." He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the reunion ballroom, direct, without performance, and said, "Good." Then he went to his office and closed the door, and Nora sat with her cold coffee and thought, "This man is not what I expected, and that is either very good or very bad, and I genuinely cannot tell yet which one it is." The first function was a Friday evening dinner at a private club on East 60th Street, called the Meridian, which had no signage visible from the street and a door that required a key card Nora did not possess. Roman handed one to her in the elevator of their building without ceremony, the way you hand someone an umbrella when it's raining. "Wear it on your wrist," he said. "Keep it on you." She did. The dinner was 12 people around a table in a room paneled in dark wood, and the conversation was about real estate, development rights, and 3 or 4 things that Nora understood to be about real estate and development rights on the surface, while meaning something else entirely beneath. She had grown up in a working-class family in the Bronx, and she had spent her adult life reading rooms. She read this one. The men at the table were polite to her in the way that men are polite to someone they have categorized as an accessory, present, decorative, not relevant to the actual conversation. All except one. His name was introduced as Martin Greer, 60, silver hair, the kind of tan that comes from boats rather than vacations. He looked at Nora across the table with an assessment that had nothing to do with her as Roman's wife, and everything to do with something she had not yet identified. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, and then looked away, which was the correct decision. Roman, beside her, had not seemed to notice. But on the way out, in the elevator, he said without looking at her, "Greer tried to read your face when I mentioned the London timeline." She said, "I know." He looked at her then. "What did he find?" She said, "Nothing I wasn't willing to give him." Roman was quiet for 2 floors. Then he said, "Good instinct." The second function was a gala at the Park Hyatt the following week, and this was where things began to become complicated. Nora wore a dress that had been sent to the apartment in a box she had not opened until that morning, a deep navy Reformation, which meant Roman Vale had someone who paid attention to details she had not provided. She did not ask how he knew her size. She put on the dress, which fit perfectly, and stood in the bathroom mirror and understood something she had been avoiding understanding. She was very good at this. She was good at holding her face still. She was good at reading lateral conversations for what they were actually about. She was good at existing in rooms where people underestimated her and using that underestimation as information. She had spent 3 years with Griffin being told, indirectly and politely, that these skills were insufficient. Standing in a 23-floor apartment on East 72nd Street, in a navy dress paid for by a man the East Coast Underground, called by a name she had not yet been told, Nora understood. The skills were never insufficient. They had simply been wasted on the wrong room. It took 11 days. Priya called on a Tuesday at 7 a.m., which was the time Priya called when something had happened that could not wait for a reasonable hour. Nora answered from the kitchen, where she was drinking coffee from a cup that was nicer than anything she had ever owned, looking at a Central Park that had gone gray and bare with November. Priya said, "I need you to look at something right now." She sent a screenshot. It was from an Instagram account that belonged to someone named Dana Rowe, who had been at the reunion and apparently had a following of 12,000 people who cared about what she observed at social events. The photograph was from the Park Hyatt Gala, taken across a crowded room, slightly blurry at the edges, but clear enough. It showed Nora in the navy dress, her dark hair up, standing next to Roman Vale. His hand was at the small of her back, not possessively, just placed there, the way you place your hand on something that belongs in your sphere, and they were talking to a man in a white tuxedo. Dana Rowe's caption read, "Spotted at the Park Hyatt. Our girl Nora Callahan from the reunion last week, apparently with Roman Vale? As in the Roman Vale? Reunion callbacks are hitting different this year." There were 412 comments. The one at the top, which had been liked 68 times, was from an account Nora recognized as belonging to Kevin Park and read, "Wait, isn't that the girl Griffin called undateable like last week?" Followed by 3 laughing emojis. Priya, on the phone, was vibrating with the specific frequency of someone who has critical information and has been waiting too long to deliver it. "Nora, do you understand what Roman Vale is?" Nora said. "What do you mean?" Priya said, "I Googled him for 40 minutes last night. He owns 8 buildings in Manhattan, 2 in Chicago, 1 in Boston. He has a profile in Forbes from 2019. He has never been photographed with a woman. He once had a city councilman investigated, and the councilman resigned in the same month. Nora, there are people in comment sections of New York crime blogs who are very convinced that Roman Vale is the reason that 3 rival..." Nora said, "Priya." Priya stopped. Nora said, "I know." Silence. Then Priya said, "How long?" Nora said, 11 days. Another silence, longer. Priya said, "And Griffin?" Nora said, "I assume he's seen it." She was correct. Griffin Shaw had seen it at 6:52 a.m. when his assistant, who followed Dana Rowe because she followed everyone relevant, forwarded it with no comment. Griffin had looked at the photograph for a long time. He had looked at Roman Vale's hand, at the small of Nora's back. He had looked at the dress. He had looked at Nora's face, which was tilted slightly up toward Roman's as they spoke, and which wore the expression of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. Something moved through Griffin Shaw in that moment that he would not, if asked, have been able to name accurately, but that functioned, in every practical way, like panic. Frank Caruso had been watching Roman Vale for 7 years with the specific patience of a man who believes he is being kept from something that rightfully belongs to him. Caruso controlled the waterfront, 3 ports, 2 unions, and a logistics network that moved things across state lines in ways that appeared, on paper, to involve only legitimate cargo. He was 55, thick through the shoulders, and had the particular confidence of a man whose threats had almost always been followed by consequences. Almost always, the exception was Roman Vale. Caruso had tried twice in 6 years to expand into Vale territory. The first time, 2 of his captains had been arrested by federal agents acting on information that could only have come from inside Caruso's organization. The second time, his logistics permit for a new warehouse in Red Hook had been denied by a city regulatory board, a board on which Roman Vale had no official seat and total influence. Caruso was not stupid. He understood that a frontal approach to Roman Vale was an approach that ended in a federal courtroom or a quiet location he would not walk out of. He needed leverage. And leverage, in his experience, was most reliably found in the shape of someone a powerful man had chosen to care about. He had people at the Park Hyatt Gala. He had people everywhere, which was the infrastructure of a certain kind of patience. His people had sent him photographs. He had looked at the woman in the navy dress, Nora Callahan, Queens, graphic designer, newly and quietly married to Roman Vale, and he had understood, with the instinct of a man who has used the same tool many times, that she was the opening. His first move was financial. He contacted Pagecraft Design Agency through a shell company. It was his shell company, though Pagecraft did not know that. And the conversation that ended Nora's contract had not been about creative direction. It had been about leverage preparation, done 3 weeks before the reunion, before Caruso even knew Nora would be connected to Roman. He had been building a file on potential weak points in Vale's life, and Nora's name had appeared on a real estate document, a building Roman Vale had quietly co-signed as a rent guarantor without telling Nora, something he had done 2 years ago through an intermediary when her landlord had been considering eviction proceedings over a payment dispute. Caruso's people had found that document. They had connected Nora to Roman before Nora had connected herself to Roman. When the Instagram photograph appeared, Caruso poured a measure of scotch and sat for a long time at his desk in a building on the Red Hook waterfront. Then he made a phone call. The phone rang in an apartment in Astoria where a man named Dennis Waite lived, a man with a contractor's license and a history of doing work that did not appear in his portfolio. Caruso said, "Find out where she goes alone, when she walks, when she runs, whether she has a routine." Dennis Waite said, "How careful?" Caruso said, "Careful enough that she doesn't know. Not careful enough that it takes too long." The Meridian Club dinner on the third Thursday of November was not on Nora's calendar, because it was not the kind of event that appeared on calendars. It was the kind of event that happened because Roman Vale said it would happen, and 15 men in that circle arranged their evenings accordingly. Nora knew this because Theo Bass had told her, in the brief, factual way that Theo communicated everything, when he handed her a second key card the week before. "This one opens the private entrance," he said. "You'll need it Thursday." She wore burgundy. She had bought it herself at a consignment shop on Madison Avenue that sold designer returns, and she had paid $212 for a dress that had originally cost $1,400, which satisfied something in her about maintaining her own accounting of things. Roman said nothing when he saw her except, "Ready?" She said yes. At the table, she was seated not at Roman's right, but across from him, an unusual arrangement that she understood, by the end of the first course, to be intentional. 3 of the men at the table were evaluating her, not as an accessory, but as a variable. One of them was a man named Paul Strand, who controlled import rights for 3 New England ports and was currently in a dispute with Caruso's waterfront operation. Strand looked at Nora twice during the appetizer course, once with assessment and once with something that was almost a test. He said, across the table, "Your wife seems comfortable in unfamiliar rooms, Roman." Roman, without looking up from his plate, said, "She's not unfamiliar with any room she's been in twice." Strand said, "Has she been in this one before?" Roman looked at Nora then, and the look was not the look of a man performing a marriage. It was the look of a man who is checking whether the person across from him is all right, and it lasted less than 2 seconds, and Nora felt it with a physical specificity she did not examine. She said to Strand, "No, but I learn quickly." Strand smiled for the first time all evening. After dinner, on the street outside the Meridian, Roman spoke with Strand for 11 minutes. Nora waited near the car with Theo, who stood 2 feet from her with his hands visible, which she had come to understand was his version of comfort, keeping the threat landscape clear. She heard Roman say, at the end of the 11 minutes, "My household is my boundary." Strand, getting into his car, said, "Noted." And that was how, without a speech or a declaration or anything that would have been visible to anyone outside of that specific world, Roman Vale informed 15 people simultaneously that Nora Callahan was under his protection. By midnight, Frank Caruso had received 3 separate messages informing him of what had been said on the street outside the Meridian, and he sat with his scotch and recalculated, because a protected woman was a different instrument than an unprotected one. More dangerous to use, but also, if the use was handled correctly, more effective. The document arrived in an envelope on a Wednesday, delivered not by mail, but placed on the kitchen table of the East 72nd Street apartment, sometime between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., while Nora was at a coffee meeting in Midtown. She found it when she came home. Her name was typed on the front in a font she did not recognize, and the return address was a law firm in White Plains she had never heard of. Inside was a single page. She read it standing at the kitchen counter with her coat still on, and she read it 3 times. And then she sat down on the kitchen floor, which she recognized as her body's specific response to information that needs a moment before it can be integrated into standing life. The document was a real estate trust transfer, dated 2 years ago. The trust had been established in her name, Nora Callahan, designer, Queens, without her knowledge or signature, because it did not require her signature. It was a revocable beneficiary designation, not a property deed. The trust's asset was a commercial property on Bedford Avenue in Brooklyn, valued at $2.3 million. The trust had been established by an entity called NCV Holdings LLC, and when Nora used her phone to look up NCV Holdings LLC, the registered agent was a man named Wade Lennox, whom she knew as Roman Vale's attorney. She sat on the kitchen floor for 11 minutes. Then she stood up, took off her coat, made coffee, and waited. Roman came home at 7. She placed the document on the walnut dining table between them. She said, "Explain this." He looked at it for a moment. He said, "I was going to tell you." She said, "When?" He said, "When it was relevant." She said, "It's been relevant for 2 years. I didn't know it existed." He sat down at the table, which was unusual. Roman rarely sat in the main rooms. He moved through them. He said, 3 years ago, before we ever met, I was negotiating the acquisition of the building you lived in Queens. My due diligence pulled the tenant list. Your name was on it, and attached to your name was a notice your landlord had filed. A dispute over 3 months of rent during a period when your freelance income had dropped significantly. I bought the building. I instructed the property manager to close the dispute and flag your file as protected tenancy. Then I established the trust as a long-term instrument in case the protection was ever needed in a more formal way. Nora looked at him across the table. "You've been—" She stopped. "You didn't know me." He said, "No." She said, "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment that did not feel like Griffin's calculated pauses. It felt like something actual. He said, "Because someone should have." And in the silence that followed, Nora Callahan, who had spent 3 years with a man who categorized her carefully, felt something rearrange in her chest that she had no name for yet, but that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the opposite of small. Priya Okafor had not meant for it to go as far as it did. This was the thing Nora would understand, eventually, when the full shape of it became clear. That Priya had not intended harm. She had intended something she had told herself was protection, which is sometimes the most damaging kind of intention. It started at the coffee shop, where Priya worked on a Tuesday in early December, when Griffin Shaw walked in. He had known from the Instagram photograph and from Kevin Park's comments and from the specific radar of a man who has recently been confronted with his own miscalculation that Priya Okafor was Nora's closest point of contact. He ordered a cortado. He sat at the bar. He said, eventually and very carefully, "I'm worried about her. I know you probably don't want to hear that from me, but I've been doing some reading about Roman Vale, and what I found concerns me." He placed his iPhone on the bar with an article pulled up. Priya looked at it. It was a profile from a legal journalism outlet that dealt in white-collar crime, and it described Roman Vale in terms that were careful in their language and specific in their implication. Priya read 2 paragraphs and felt something cold move through her. She had already been feeling it. Had been feeling it since Nora moved into the East 72nd Street apartment, and started appearing at events in designer dresses and saying things like, "I can't talk about that right now," with a careful evenness that was new. She loved Nora completely, and she was afraid, and Griffin Shaw in that moment appeared as the specific kind of reasonable concern that finds purchase in fear. She did not give him the address of the apartment. She did not give him Nora's new number. What she gave him, because he asked, and she was afraid. And love does not always protect us from our worst decisions. The date and location of the Vale Industries holiday function on December 14th, which she knew because Nora had mentioned it. That was all. That was enough. Griffin attended the function by doing something that required only money and confidence. He purchased a table through a charity proxy that was listed as a co-sponsor of the event. He arrived at the Mandarin Oriental on December 14th at 7:30 and spent 22 minutes in the room before Nora saw him. When she did, she felt the specific cold of a system failing. She did not show it on her face. She turned to the woman she had been speaking with and said, "Excuse me one moment." Then she walked directly to where Theo Bass was standing near the east wall, and she said quietly, "Griffin Shaw is in this room. He is my ex-boyfriend. He does not have an invitation through any legitimate connection to this event." Theo Bass said nothing. He took out his phone. And across the room, Roman Vale, who had been deep in conversation with Paul Strand, looked up. Not because he had heard anything, but because something in the quality of the room had shifted, and Roman Vale had spent 20 years learning to read rooms the way other people read words, which meant he felt the change before he saw the cause. They took her on a Thursday morning in the third week of December, between the dry cleaner on Lexington Avenue and the coffee shop on 71st Street. A 7-minute walk she had made 4 times in the previous 2 weeks, which was exactly the information Dennis Waite had been collecting. She had sent Theo Bass ahead because he had mentioned errands in the same direction, and she had told him she was fine for the 7 minutes, that she did not need accompaniment for 7 blocks, that she was a 32-year-old woman who had been navigating New York alone for a decade. And Theo had given her a look that communicated clearly that he disagreed, but respected her autonomy, and she had walked out of the building into the December cold and known, 3 blocks in, that something was wrong. 2 men. One in front, one behind. The one behind closed the distance too deliberately for coincidence, and the one in front had been standing in the same spot she had noticed him in yesterday morning, which no legitimate person does in December at 9:15 on a residential block in the Upper East Side. She had read enough of Roman's world by then to understand what was happening before it happened. She turned east on 71st instead of west, which bought her 1 additional block. She pressed the contact labeled T on her phone, Theo, who was 4 blocks away, and said when it connected, "2 men. 71st between Lex and 3rd. I'm walking east." Then the first man caught her arm, and her phone hit the pavement, and the screen cracked on impact, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her. This is what it feels like to be inside the story instead of watching it. The car that came alongside her was black, a Suburban with tinted windows, and the man who opened the door was not young and not nervous, which meant he had done this before. She got in because the alternative involved a scene on a residential block that would go badly for her either way, and she had already made the call to Theo, and now it was a matter of time. Inside the car, across from her, was a man she recognized from a photograph Roman had shown her during the 3rd week of her residence. A briefing she had not asked for, but that Roman had conducted anyway. Faces she should know, he said, and the lesson had been presented with the same flat precision as everything Roman did, and she had memorized them because she was the kind of person who took information seriously regardless of whether she thought she would need it. The man was Frank Caruso, and he looked at her with the assessment of someone examining an instrument. She looked back at him with no expression she was willing to let him use. He said, "I need 20 minutes of your husband's attention." She said, "Call his office." He smiled, which did not reach anything above his jaw. She said nothing else. 4 blocks away, Theo Bass was already running. And on the 49th floor of a building on Park Avenue, Roman Vale's phone lit up with a message that contained her location, and something crossed his face that his staff had never seen before in 20 years. Something that resolved, in the length of a breath, into absolute and total stillness. There are men who respond to threat with noise, raised voices, accelerated motion, the performance of urgency. Roman Vale did the opposite. When his phone showed Theo's location tag and the single word "now," he set down his coffee cup with precision, buttoned his jacket, and said to Wade Lennox, who was sitting across from him, "Clear my afternoon." Lennox, who had worked for Roman for 12 years, recognized the specific quality of that sentence and did not ask why. Roman made 2 calls in the elevator. The first was to Theo. He said, "Status." Theo said, "Black Suburban, east on 71st, heading toward FDR. 2 men plus driver plus Caruso. She's unharmed. I have visual." Roman said, "Don't lose it." He ended the call. The second call was to a number he dialed from memory. When it connected, he said, "I need the FDR sealed between exits 10 and 11 in 11 minutes. A water main will work." The voice on the other end said only, "Understood." He was in his car in 4 minutes. What happened in the following 37 minutes was a specific kind of operation that Frank Caruso had not calculated for, because Caruso operated through visible force and had assumed Roman did the same. Roman did not. The Suburban's path along the FDR was interrupted by 3 vehicles, a panel van, a city water department truck that appeared from nowhere, and a second SUV that materialized from the 71st Street exit ramp. Not dramatically, not with sirens or violence, but with the particular precision of chess pieces moved by someone who has been playing the board longer than anyone else in the game. The Suburban stopped. It had no other option. Roman's car pulled alongside. The window came down. Roman looked at Frank Caruso through the glass for a moment that lasted, by Nora's count, approximately 7 seconds. Then the Suburban's back door opened. Nora got out onto the FDR shoulder in her coat, her broken phone in her hand, her face composed in a way that cost her something she would feel later. She walked to Roman's car without looking back. Theo, who had appeared from the front vehicle, was already opening the door for her. She got in. She sat. Roman got in beside her without hurrying. The car moved. Behind them, the Suburban sat motionless on the FDR shoulder for another 3 minutes, surrounded by vehicles it could not navigate around, while inside it, Frank Caruso held his phone and made calls that were not answered because the men he called were currently being spoken to by federal agents acting on information about a specific offshore account that had been delivered anonymously and thoroughly documented to the FBI's Organized Crime Division at 9:17 that morning. Nora, in the car beside Roman, said, "You moved a water main." He said, "The city moves them for utility emergencies." She said, "Is that what this was?" He looked at her. His face was doing something she had not seen on it before. Not open, not soft, but present in a way that felt like the guard had come down by approximately 1 degree, and on Roman Vale 1 degree was significant. He said, "Are you all right?" And the way he said it, quiet, direct, without the specific weight of obligation, made the question feel like the most honest thing anyone had asked her in years. She did not sit in the apartment and wait to feel safe. This was the thing Roman had not calculated, which she understood later was because he had not yet fully understood what kind of person she was. Nora Callahan, when frightened, did not contract. She organized. The morning after the FDR incident, while Roman was in a series of meetings she was not part of, Nora sat at the kitchen table with her cracked screen phone and her MacBook Air and did 4 things in sequence. First, she pulled up every document she had been given since December 1st. The contract terms, the trust documentation from NCV Holdings, the corporate filing for Vale Industries that Wade Lennox had provided during orientation. And she read all of it with the focused attention she applied to client briefs, which was the most precise attention she possessed. Second, she searched the registered agent records for 3 shell companies she had identified in the trust document periphery and found that one of them, a company called Parcel Ridge LLC, appeared in a 2021 City Council filing related to a zoning dispute on Bedford Avenue in Brooklyn. A zoning dispute she had reported on for a small local newspaper in 2021, because at that time she had been doing occasional editorial design work for them and had sat in on the hearing as a background matter. She had a photograph on her phone from that day, taken without editorial intent, that showed the back of a room during a recess. In the photograph, slightly out of focus, was a man she now recognized as Griffin Shaw, in conversation with a city official whose name she had never registered. Third, she forwarded the photograph to Wade Lennox with a single sentence. "I think this is relevant." Fourth, she called Priya. The call lasted 6 minutes. Priya cried at minute 2. Nora did not. She said, "I need you to tell me exactly what you told him and when." Priya told her. Nora listened completely. Then she said, "I'm not angry at you. I need you to understand that so we can move past it. But I need to know. Does Griffin know anything about what I've found in these documents?" Priya said, "No. I didn't know any of it. How could I have told him?" Nora said, "Good." She said, "I need one more thing." And Priya, who had been Griffin's occasional legal researcher during their relationship, she had done it for 2 years as a favor typing case notes, said she still had login access to a legal research database Griffin used professionally, access he had never revoked because Griffin was careless with administrative details. Nora said, "Search for Parcel Ridge LLC and Griffin Shaw, any document connection, any co-filing, anything." Priya said, "Nora, if I find something..." Nora said, "Send it to Wade Lennox, whatever you find. Don't filter it, don't protect him, don't overthink it. Send it." That evening, Wade Lennox called Nora at 6:42. He said, "Where did you find the photograph?" She said, "I took it in 2021. I just didn't know what I was looking at." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ms. Callahan, with your permission, I'd like to add you to the Vale Industries Advisory Board for Creative Development, effective immediately, because what you just did in 8 hours took my team 3 weeks last year, and you did it alone at a kitchen table." The last piece arrived on a Tuesday, which Nora had come to think of as the day of the week when the universe delivered its most structurally significant information. It came from Wade Lennox in a folder, physical, hand-delivered by Theo Bass at 11 in the morning. Inside were 16 pages. Nora read them in the order they were presented, which was chronological, which meant she understood the shape of the full story the way you read a novel. Beginning to end, each new page recontextualizing what came before. Page 1. Griffin Shaw had been introduced 4 years ago to a man named Paul Aldous, who served as a liaison between the City Council's zoning committee and a set of private development interests. Page 3. Griffin, through Aldous, had connected 2 of those development interests to properties in Queens, including the building on Woodside where Nora had lived. Page 6. The building's sale to the new development company, which had triggered Nora's 30-day notice, had been processed through a deal that Griffin had co-originated as legal counsel for the purchasing entity. Page 9. The purchasing entity was a subsidiary of Parcel Ridge LLC. Page 12. Parcel Ridge LLC's primary investor, through 3 layers of corporate structure, was Frank Caruso. The man who had put her in a car on the FDR had, through Griffin Shaw, been the reason she had needed to leave her apartment in the first place. Griffin had not known. The document trail made that relatively clear. The connections were too well obscured for someone at Griffin's level to have seen them, but he had participated, carelessly and profitably, in a chain that had ended in Nora's 30-day notice, and her desperation and the particular vulnerability that had led her to sign Roman Vale's contract in a Midtown office on a Thursday. She sat with the document for a long time. She thought about the reunion ballroom. She thought about Griffin's voice saying who would even marry you with the ease of a man who believed himself accurate. She thought about what it had felt like to stand still and not know that in the chain of events connecting that moment to this kitchen table, Griffin Shaw was one of the links. She thought about the NCV Holdings Trust, established 2 years ago, which meant Roman Vale had been, in a financial sense, protecting her from a displacement that Griffin Shaw had, unknowingly, helped to engineer. She thought, this is the part of the story that nobody would believe if you told it. Then she thought, it doesn't matter whether anyone believes it. It happened. She closed the folder. She opened her MacBook. She had a design pitch to prepare, a new client, a nonprofit arts organization in Brooklyn that had found her through a referral, paying $15,000 for a complete brand identity, her largest independent contract in 2 years. She had found the client herself. She had quoted the fee herself. She had earned it before any of it. The apartment, the navy dress, the walnut table, the man who came home at 10:47 and said the kitchen is fully stocked. And that, she understood, was the only accounting that had ever mattered. The New York Bar Association's notice arrived at Griffin Shaw's office on a Friday in January, and it was, in the language of regulatory bodies, brief and precise. It cited 3 matters: his involvement as legal counsel to an entity with undisclosed ties to a state-registered person of interest in an organized crime investigation, a failure to conduct adequate due diligence on client corporate structures in 2 instances, and the matter of a specific zoning meeting in 2021 for which his logged presence created what the association described as a potential conflict of interest given subsequent client engagements. It was not disbarment, not immediately. It was the opening of a formal review process, which was in some ways worse, because it was slow and visible and ongoing, and the legal community in New York is a small and attentive one. His firm's managing partner called him into a meeting that lasted 40 minutes. Griffin came out of it with his partnership track suspended pending the outcome of the review. Hadley Wren, whose father owned 3 buildings in Midtown and who had attended Columbia and who had stood beside Griffin at the reunion in sapphire silk, called that same evening and said, with the particular candor of someone who has been advised by their own family to make a clean separation, "I think we need some space, Griffin. I'm sure it'll sort itself out." She said it in the tone of someone who does not believe it will sort itself out. The photograph Nora had taken in 2021, the one showing Griffin in the background of a city council hearing room, speaking to a zoning official, had been submitted as supporting documentation by Wade Lennox to the Bar Association in January, with full provenance noted. The photograph itself was not damning. It was one piece of many, but it had opened the document review that had found the other pieces, and that was sufficient. Griffin Shaw did not know, as he sat in his apartment in Carroll Gardens that January evening, with a glass of bourbon he was not drinking, that the photograph had come from Nora. He suspected Roman Vale. He suspected federal interference. He suspected the system of a powerful man protecting his interests. He did not suspect the woman he had told, in a warm ballroom, that no one would marry her, because men like Griffin Shaw do not readily calculate that the woman they underestimated has been quietly and alone at a kitchen table, doing the work. He sat in his apartment. His career was suspended. His relationship was over. His name was in 2 separate legal proceedings as a peripheral figure, which meant it would appear in searches, which meant every future client introduction would carry that shadow. His mother, Elaine Shaw, called once that week. She said, "I told you to be more careful about who you worked with. Not, I told you to be more careful about who you dismissed." Elaine Shaw had the instincts of a socialite and the empathy of a balance sheet. Griffin sat in his Carroll Gardens apartment on a January night that smelled like cold radiator heat and old wood, and he thought about a woman in a black dress standing very still in a ballroom on West 45th Street, and he understood, with a specificity that arrived like a key turning in a lock he had not known was there, exactly what he had said, and exactly what it had cost him. Frank Caruso had survived 30 years in a business that did not offer tenure. He had survived by being better than the competition at 2 things: patience and calculation. He had not survived by being wrong about power. He had been wrong about Roman Vale. The federal indictment came in February, and it was thorough in the way that federal indictments are when the case has been built over multiple years by an agency that has had consistently accurate information. The charge list was long. It included the offshore account structures, the union interference, the logistics network that the indictment described with specificity Caruso recognized as coming from inside his own organization, from files he kept on a server he had believed was clean, accessed through a channel he had believed was protected, by a technical intrusion that had occurred, according to the indictment's timeline, on the same morning Nora had been returned to Roman Vale's car on the FDR shoulder. There was also the matter of the kidnapping charge, which was state, not federal, and which derived from 11 minutes in a black Suburban on a December morning, witnessed by a city water department employee whose truck had been present due to an emergency utility call, and who had produced a clear dash cam recording of a woman being placed into a vehicle against her will at 9:22 a.m. on East 71st Street. Caruso had told his attorney the dash cam was a problem before the indictment came. His attorney had said it was manageable. His attorney had not managed it. Caruso's bail hearing produced a number that was set specifically to be unachievable, not because the judge had been told to set it there, but because Roman Vale had spent 3 months ensuring that every financial instrument Caruso might use to secure it had been legally frozen, transferred, or restructured out of Caruso's accessible reach through a set of civil proceedings that had run parallel to the federal investigation, and that Caruso had not noticed because they were filed under his subsidiaries' names rather than his own. He was, as of the February bail hearing, a man of considerable nominal assets and no liquid means to access any of them. He sat in federal holding and looked at his attorney and understood, for the first time in 30 years, what it felt like to have met the edge of your own reach. Roman Vale was not in court for the bail hearing. He was in London, finalizing a partnership agreement with 3 European entities who had been awaiting the conclusion of a personal stability assessment that their due diligence team had now completed. Their assessment was favorable. The agreement was signed on a Wednesday. Roman called Nora from London at 6 in the evening, which was noon in New York, and she was at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, meeting with the nonprofit arts organization about Phase 2 of their brand rollout. She stepped outside to take the call. He said, "London is done." She said, "Good. How long until you're back?" He said, "Saturday." She said, "I'll be home." There was a pause, and in that pause, both of them registered the word she had used, and neither of them corrected it, and the pause lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Before she said she had to go back inside, and he said, "Of course." And they ended the call, and both of them stood for a moment, one in London, one on a Brooklyn sidewalk, in the specific quiet of people who have just named something they were not expecting to name today. The Bedford Avenue property transferred to Nora's name on a Thursday in March, when the NCV Holdings Trust was converted to a direct ownership instrument, and Wade Lennox handed her a set of keys that were heavier than she expected. The building was a 3-story commercial space in Williamsburg. Ground floor had been a restaurant. Second floor was divided office space. Third floor was a large open area that had most recently been used for storage and had 12-foot ceilings and east-facing windows that caught the morning light in a way that made Nora stand in it for 4 minutes the first time she walked through. She had a plan. She had been building it in a Google Doc she had been opening and closing for 2 years, and she opened it the week after the London deal closed and read it through completely for the first time, and found that most of it was still true. The ground floor she contracted out to a local restaurant group. The lease generated enough to cover the building's operating costs. The second-floor office space she rented to 3 small creative businesses at below-market rates, structured on a sliding scale, because she had been a small creative business renting at market rate in a city that made that difficult, and she had not forgotten what that felt like. The third floor she kept. She called it the Callahan Studio, which was the least creative name she had ever chosen and which she liked precisely for that reason. No mythology, no brand narrative, just the name of the person responsible. It opened on the 1st of April, which she chose for the symmetry of new beginnings, with a capacity for 12 designers working in shared open space, a small gallery wall that rotated every 6 weeks, and a residency program for emerging graphic designers that provided a monthly stipend funded by a portion of the building's lease income. She designed the identity herself. Dark type on warm cream, a mark that looked like a window seen from outside, and a frame seen from inside simultaneously, which had taken her 11 iterations to get right. Priya came to the soft opening with coffee from her shop, and they stood in the 3rd floor with its east light and its 12-foot ceilings, and Priya said, "You know you built this, right?" Nora said, "I know." She meant it simply, without performance, which was different from how she would have said it 18 months ago, when she would have qualified it, added the details of what she'd had help with, made sure the person listening understood she was not overclaiming. She did not do that anymore. She had built it. The help was part of it. The trust, the contract, the January photograph. But so was the 3-year education with Griffin, and the 43-person reunion ballroom, and the MacBook Air that had been open every morning at 7, regardless of what the day before had looked like. All of it was part of it. She stood in the east light of the 3rd floor, and looked at what she had made and felt. Not relief, not triumph, but the specific quiet satisfaction of a person who has finally stopped building for someone else's idea of what she should become, and started building for the actual shape of herself. He came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the opening, which was not a day she had told him about. She found out later that Theo had mentioned it, not as a briefing, but in passing, the way people mention things they think the other person should know. Roman arrived at the Bedford Avenue building at 11:15 in the morning, which was when Nora was in the third-floor studio running a feedback session with 4 of the resident designers on a transit authority branding project they were developing together. She did not see him come in. She was at the front of the space with a printout pinned to the wall and a marker in her hand, saying something about typographic hierarchy and institutional trust, and how those two things were more connected than most clients admitted. And the 4 designers were engaged in the specific way that people are engaged when they are being taught something they can actually use. Roman stood at the back of the room for 7 minutes. She did not know this until later, when one of the resident designers, a 24-year-old from the Bronx named Kira, who was doing the residency on a stipend and who had the specific observational instincts of someone who has learned to read rooms for safety, mentioned it quietly during the coffee break. There was a man here, very tall. He watched the whole thing and then he left. He looked at you the whole time. He looked like he was figuring something out. Nora had found Roman downstairs in the ground floor, which was not yet open as a restaurant, but had a folding table and 2 chairs that the contractor had left behind. He was standing at the table looking at the brand identity materials she had pinned to the temporary wall, the cream and dark type, the window frame mark, the residency program description. She said, "You came." He said, "I wanted to see it." She said, "You could have told me you were coming." He said, "You would have prepared." She looked at him. He was wearing the same kind of dark suit he always wore, but he had left the jacket on the folding chair and stood in shirt sleeves, which was the most informal she had ever seen him, and it changed the dimension of him slightly. Not smaller, but more present. He said, "The residency stipend. It's under-resourced for what you're trying to do." She said, "I know. I'm applying for 2 grants in June." He said, "I could." She said, "No." She said it without heat, not defensive, just clear. He looked at her with an expression that had no calculation in it, which was the rarest thing she had seen on his face. She said, "I know you could solve it faster. I need to solve it the right way." He said, "I understand." And she believed him. She sat down in one of the contractor's chairs, and he sat in the other one, and they were in an empty restaurant on Bedford Avenue in Williamsburg at 11:30 in the morning, surrounded by brand materials and contractor dust. And he said, "The 6 months end in 2 weeks." She said, "I know." He said, "I would like to discuss what happens after that." She looked at him, at the gray eyes and the silver at his temples and the careful way he occupied space even in a folding chair. And she thought, "This is the most honest conversation I have been in for a very long time." She said, "Tell me what you actually want, not what makes sense, not what's strategic, what you want." And Roman Vale, who had not answered that question honestly to another person in 20 years, was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he told her. The dissolution was never filed. Wade Lennox had prepared the paperwork in January, standard, ready for the March signature date, and on March 3rd, Nora had looked at the folder on the kitchen table of the East 72nd Street apartment, and then looked at Roman across the walnut desk and said, "I need more time before I decide." He had said, "How much time?" She had said, "I don't know yet." He had said, "All right." And the folder had sat. April became May. The Callahan studio accepted its second cohort of residents. The Transit Authority branding project was selected as a finalist for a National Design Award, which Nora found out from an email on a Tuesday morning while she was eating toast in the kitchen that had always been fully stocked. And she made a sound she immediately tried to suppress, which Roman heard from the hallway. And he came to the kitchen doorway and said, "What?" She turned the laptop around so he could read the email. He read it. Then he looked at her, and the thing that crossed his face, so briefly, so controlled, but there, unmistakably there, was pride. Not the performance of pride. Pride. She had not seen that specific expression directed at her since she was 8 years old, and her father watched her win a school art competition and said, in Italian, the phrase her grandmother had taught him. "This is what it looks like when someone becomes what they were always going to be." Roman said, "You're going to win it." She said, "You don't know that." He said, "I know what winning looks like before it arrives. I've been watching for it for a long time." The 6-month mark passed. The folder sat in Wade Lennox's office. In June, at the Design Award ceremony at the Cooper Hewitt on 5th Avenue, Nora sat at a table in a room of 200 people, and her name was called, and she walked to the front of the room in a dress she had bought herself at the Madison Avenue consignment shop. Ivory this time, $180, and it fit, and she accepted the award and said 11 sentences that she had not prepared, because she had found, in the previous 6 months, that she was most honest when she was least prepared, and the 11 sentences were about what it meant to build something in a city that made building difficult, and about the designers in her studio who were building things with her. She did not mention Roman. She did not need to. He was 4 tables back. He had come because she had asked him, which was the first time she had asked, and he had said yes without qualifying it. Afterward, on 5th Avenue, the June air warm and the Museum of Natural History lit across Central Park in the distance. He stood beside her while she held the award, and he said, "I want to keep being in your life, not as a contract, not as a structure." He paused, and it was not Griffin's performative pause. It was the pause of a man choosing his words with the same care he applied to everything, because he did not want to be imprecise about this. He said, "I want to be in whatever room you're in whatever city. I want to be the person you call when something goes right, not only when something has gone wrong." Nora looked at him in the June evening on 5th Avenue, this man who had watched her from a reunion ballroom and moved a water main on the FDR and sat in a folding chair on Bedford Avenue in his shirt sleeves, and told her, 3 seconds after she asked, what he actually wanted. She looked at the award in her hands. She thought about the girl in the Banana Republic dress who had stood completely still and decided not to look for the exit. She thought about the apartment in Queens, the cracked phone screen, the kitchen table at 7 in the morning where she had done the work regardless. She thought, "I built this, and this man has been walking alongside it, not ahead of it." She said, "I'm keeping the studio." She said, "I'm keeping the apartment in Queens, not to live in, but because it was mine first, and I'm not ready to let it be anything else yet." He said, "I know." She said, "And I want to keep the East 72nd apartment. With you." He looked at her. His face in the June light was doing the thing it had done in the contractor chair on Bedford Avenue. Present, without guard, 1 degree open. He said, "Yes." She said, "The folder in Wade's office." He said, "I'll tell him to file it under things that didn't happen." She said, "That's not a legal category." He said, "No, but Wade is creative." She laughed, and it was the sound she made when something was genuinely funny. A real sound, uncareful. The laugh she had stopped making sometime in the second year with Griffin and had not noticed was gone until now. Hearing it return. Roman looked at her when she laughed as though he was memorizing the sound for the purpose of hearing it again. On a Wednesday in July, Elaine Shaw called her son Griffin and said, "I understand Nora Callahan won a National Design Award." Griffin was sitting in his Carroll Gardens apartment, where his bourbon was warm and his partnership review was ongoing, and Hadley Wren's Instagram showed her in Nantucket with someone else. He said, "Yes." Elaine said, "You said no one would marry her." Griffin said nothing. Elaine said, "She married Roman Vale." He said nothing. Elaine said, "Roman Vale, whose net worth Forbes estimates at..." Griffin said, "Mom, please." Elaine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I just think you should know exactly what you said and to whom you said it, so that the next time you open your mouth to categorize someone, you have this specific memory available." She ended the call. Griffin sat in his apartment on a summer evening in Carroll Gardens and looked at his warm bourbon and thought about a woman in a black dress standing completely still. Across the city, in an apartment on East 72nd Street with Central Park outside the window and a design award on the kitchen counter beside a MacBook Air and 2 cups of coffee that were not yet cold, Nora Callahan sat at the walnut table across from Roman Vale, and neither of them was performing anything. They were just 2 people, in a room, after everything, at the beginning of something that did not need a name yet because it was already real. Outside, the July city moved and breathed and lit itself as cities do, indifferent and magnificent. And inside the apartment, the coffee was still warm, and the window was open, and Nora was exactly where she had built herself to be. So the story has closed now. And if you're still here, if you made it all the way to this moment, then something in this story touched you. Maybe it was Nora standing completely still in that ballroom, while the man she once loved told a room full of people she wasn't worth choosing. Maybe it was the way she didn't scream, didn't collapse, didn't beg. She just stood there and decided quietly that his words were not her ending. Here's what I want you to sit with. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Nora didn't find her strength when Roman Vale walked into her life. She found it the moment she stopped letting someone else's assessment of her become her own. The love, the studio, the award, those were consequences. The decision was hers first. If someone has ever looked at you and told you who you weren't, hear this. They were only ever describing the limits of their own imagination, not yours. If this story meant something to you today, leave Nora in the comments. Share this with one person who needs to hear it. Subscribe, because we tell stories here that don't let you leave unchanged. You were always the one building the thing worth having. You just needed a story to remind you. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, names, events, organizations, and locations portrayed in this narrative, including Nora Callahan, Roman Vale, Griffin Shaw, and all associated individuals and entities, are entirely fictional and the product of the writer's imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The Mafia organizations, criminal activities, and underground networks depicted in this story are dramatized fictional elements designed to serve the narrative and do not represent, glorify, or encourage real-world criminal behavior of any kind. All emotional and romantic storylines are fictional dramatizations intended solely for storytelling purposes. This content is produced for mature audiences who understand the distinction between fictional drama and reality. The themes explored, including self-worth, resilience, and personal growth, are universal human experiences presented through a fictional lens. Viewer discretion is advised.